Raw emotion today inside a Detroit courtroom as Earl Maxwell was sentenced for the cold-blooded murder of his girlfriend.
Making matters worse is what Maxwell said to the court before his sentence was handed down.
Father's Day, 2017, 8 p.m. in Detroit, Michigan. 4-year-old Jada sits cross-legged on her mother's bed, watching with innocent eyes as 42-year-old Latrice Morris Dorsey gets dressed for what should have been a joyful family celebration. The little girl has no idea she's about to witness her mother's brutal execution. The front door opens without warning. Heavy footsteps echo through the hallway as Earl Maxwell, Latrice's obsessed ex-boyfriend, walks straight into her bedroom like he owns the place. He looks down at little Jada with a cold smile and says those bone-chilling words that would haunt investigators for years. "Hi, Jada." Then he pulls out his gun and fires 10 bullets into Latrice's body, while her 4-year-old daughter watches in absolute terror. 10 shots. Not one. Not two. 10 deliberate, calculated shots that tore through a mother's chest, back, and head as her baby girl screamed for help that would never come in time. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing. During his trial, this monster had the audacity to stand before the judge and justify his actions with these exact words that were caught on courtroom audio. "We were supposed to be dating. We were still dating until this plumber guy came along." Can you believe that? He murdered a mother of 3 in front of her child and then blamed her for dating someone new. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated revenge from a man who refused to accept that his victim had moved on with her life. What's worse is that this entire tragedy could have been prevented. Police received over 20 death threats about this exact situation. 20 separate warnings that Earl Maxwell was going to kill Latrice Morris Dorsey, and they did absolutely nothing to protect her or her children. If you can't hit subscribe after hearing what happened to this family, at least tell us why in the comments below. Before we get into how the system completely failed this family, you need to understand who Latrice Morris Dorsey really was. Because this wasn't just another statistic in domestic violence reports. This was a woman who had everything to live for and was finally getting her life back on track after years of struggle. Latrice worked as a physical therapist in Detroit, spending her days helping people recover from injuries and get back to living their best lives. She had that rare combination of medical knowledge and genuine compassion that made her patients feel like they were more than just another appointment on her schedule. Her colleagues described her as someone who would stay late just to make sure a patient understood their exercises correctly. At home, she was raising 3 children as a single mother. Her oldest daughter was away at college, working toward her own dreams. 14-year-old Justin was a freshman in high school with a passion for football and video games. And then there was 4-year-old Jada, the baby of the family who followed her mom around like a little shadow, always wanting to help with everything. Latrice had recently finalized her divorce from Paul Dorsey, the father of her children. It wasn't a bitter split, just 2 people who realized they were better as co-parents than as husband and wife. Paul remained actively involved in the kids' lives, and they maintained a respectful relationship for the sake of their family. That's when Earl Maxwell entered the picture. Latrice met him at a time when she was rediscovering who she was as an independent woman. She wasn't looking for anything serious, but Earl was charming, attentive, and seemed to understand that she came as a package deal with 3 kids. What started as casual dating quickly became something more intense. For 4 years, Earl and Latrice built what appeared to be a solid relationship. He was so committed to her that he even got her name tattooed on his left arm, a permanent declaration of his feelings that should have been romantic but would later become evidence of his obsession. To outsiders, they looked like a couple who had found their happy ending. But relationships that burn bright often burn out just as quickly. After 4 years together, Latrice began to notice changes in Earl's behavior that made her uncomfortable. He was becoming increasingly possessive, questioning her about where she went and who she talked to. The man who once respected her independence was now trying to control every aspect of her life. Latrice made the decision that many strong women make when they realize a relationship is no longer serving them. She ended things with Earl and made it clear that she was ready to move forward with her life. She found a new place for herself and the kids, a fresh start where she could focus on being the mother and professional she wanted to be. That's when she met someone new, A plumber who treated her with the respect and kindness she deserved. Someone who didn't try to control her or make her feel guilty for having a life outside of their relationship. For Latrice, this new relationship represented hope and the possibility of genuine happiness. What Latrice didn't realize was that ending things with Earl Maxwell would trigger a campaign of terror that would consume the final months of her life. Because Earl wasn't the type of man who accepted rejection gracefully. He was the type who believed that love gave him ownership over another human being. The harassment started immediately after their breakup. Earl began calling Latrice constantly, sometimes dozens of times in a single day. When she didn't answer, he would leave voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening. He showed up at her workplace, forcing her to have uncomfortable conversations with security about keeping him away from the building. Latrice did everything victims are told to do in these situations. She blocked his number from her phone. She blocked him on every social media platform she used. She changed her daily routines to avoid places where she might run into him. She even moved to a new house with her children, hoping that distance would finally send the message that their relationship was over. But Earl Maxwell was nothing if not persistent. When he couldn't reach Latrice directly, he found another way to get his message across. He started calling her ex-husband Paul Dorsey, the father of her children. And what Paul heard during those phone calls would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first call came late at night in early June of 2017. Paul answered expecting maybe a work emergency or a family member calling with news. Instead, he heard Earl's voice, shaky with rage and alcohol, delivering a message that made his blood run cold. "When I see your wife, I'm gonna kill her." Paul tried to calm Earl down, thinking maybe this was just the angry rambling of a heartbroken man who'd had too much to drink. He spent 20 minutes on the phone trying to talk sense into him, explaining that Latrice had every right to move on with her life, and that threats weren't going to change anything. But Earl called back 5 minutes later. This time, his voice was different, colder, more determined. He repeated the same threat, word for word, as if he was rehearsing what he planned to do. Then he hung up without another word. Over the next 2 weeks, Paul received more than 20 phone calls from Earl Maxwell. Each one contained variations of the same message. "I'm going to hurt her. She can't do this to me. If I can't have her, nobody can." The threats became more specific, more detailed, more terrifying with each conversation. Paul documented every single call. He wrote down the dates, the times, and the exact words Earl used. He begged Earl to get help, to talk to someone, to find a way to move on without violence. But Earl's response was always the same. Latrice belonged to him, and if she thought she could replace him with someone else, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The most chilling call came just 1 week before Father's Day. Earl's voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact, as he delivered his final warning. "If I don't get in touch with your ex-wife, I'm going to come and shoot her in the head." There was no emotion, no hesitation, just a simple statement of intention that sounded more like a weather report than a death threat. Paul immediately called Latrice and told her everything. Every threat, every phone call, every reason she had to be afraid. Together, they made the decision that victims are always told to make in these situations. They contacted the police. Here's where the system that was supposed to protect Latrice Morris Dorsey completely broke down. Because when Paul Dorsey walked into that Detroit police station with detailed documentation of over 20 death threats, he expected officers to take immediate action to protect the mother of his children. Instead, he got excuses, paperwork, and a pat on the shoulder. The first officer Paul spoke with barely looked up from his computer screen as Paul explained the escalating threats Earl Maxwell had been making. When Paul mentioned that Earl had specifically said he was going to shoot her in the head, the officer asked if Earl had actually shown up at Latrice's house with a weapon. When Paul said no, the officer shrugged and said there wasn't much they could do about angry phone calls. Paul pushed back, explaining that these weren't just angry phone calls. These were detailed, repeated threats of murder from a man who knew where Latrice lived and worked. The officer handed him a domestic violence pamphlet and suggested that Latrice could file for a restraining order if she felt threatened enough. A restraining order, a piece of paper that would take weeks to process, and would only be enforceable after Earl had already violated it. Paul left that police station feeling more helpless than when he'd walked in. The people who were supposed to serve and protect had basically told him to come back after the murder had already happened. Latrice tried a different approach. She contacted the police directly, explaining that her ex-boyfriend had been making death threats through her children's father. She provided Earl's full name, his address, his physical description, and even mentioned a tattoo of her name on his arm that would make him easy to identify. The responding officer took notes, but explained that verbal threats weren't considered credible unless they were accompanied by specific actions. Had Earl shown up at her house? Had he followed her to work? Had he physically threatened her in person? When Latrice answered no to each question, the officer suggested she change her phone number and avoid places where she might encounter him. Change her phone number. As if Earl Maxwell didn't know where she lived, where she worked, and where her children went to school. As if a new phone number would somehow make a determined stalker forget that his target existed. What makes this police response even more infuriating is that everything Earl Maxwell was doing fit the exact pattern that domestic violence experts use to predict escalating danger. A recent breakup, obsessive behavior, threats made through third parties, and statements about ownership of the victim. Every single red flag was there, documented and reported to authorities who had the power to intervene. The final insult came just 3 days before Latrice's murder, when Paul made one last desperate call to the police department. He told them about Earl's most recent threat, to shoot her in the head, and begged them to do something, anything, to protect Latrice and her children. The officer who took the call told him they would keep an eye out for Earl Maxwell and advised him to call back if anything actually happened. Keep an eye out. As if Earl Maxwell was going to announce his intentions to the first police officer he encountered. As if a man who had spent weeks planning to commit murder was going to be deterred by the possibility that someone might be watching. 3 days later, Earl Maxwell walked into Latrice Morris Dorsey's home and executed her while her 4-year-old daughter watched. Every single one of those 20 death threats had been a promise, not just angry words from a broken heart. Father's Day 2017 was supposed to be a celebration. Latrice had planned to spend the evening with her father and sisters, one of those simple family gatherings that create the memories you treasure for a lifetime. She was getting dressed in her bedroom around 8 o'clock that evening, choosing an outfit that would be appropriate for dinner with her family. 4-year-old Jada was doing what little girls do when they adore their mothers. She sat on the bed, watching Latrice get ready with the kind of fascination that only children possess. To Jada, her mother was the most beautiful woman in the world, and watching her put on makeup and choose jewelry was better than any television show. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Justin was in the back room, completely absorbed in his Xbox with his headphones on. He was at that age where video games provided an escape from the world, and he was deep into whatever adventure was playing out on his screen. The headphones blocked out everything around him, creating a bubble of teenage solitude that felt safe and familiar. None of them heard Earl Maxwell enter the house. He had a key from when he and Latrice were together, or maybe he forced his way in through a door or window. The exact method didn't matter, because the result was the same. A man who had spent weeks planning murder was now inside the home of his intended victim. Earl walked through the house like he still belonged there, moving with the confidence of someone who believed he had every right to be where he was. When he reached Latrice's bedroom doorway, he stopped and took in the scene. The woman who had rejected him, getting dressed to go celebrate with her family. The little girl who had probably heard stories about Earl, but didn't understand why he wasn't around anymore. What happened next shows the true calculation behind Earl's actions. He didn't burst into the room in a rage. He didn't start screaming or immediately pull out his weapon. Instead, he looked down at 4-year-old Jada with what witnesses later described as an almost pleasant expression and spoke to her in the same tone you might use to greet a neighbor's child. "Hi, Jada." 2 words that would echo in that little girl's mind for the rest of her life. 2 words that proved Earl Maxwell wasn't acting in the heat of passion or temporary insanity. He was calm enough to acknowledge a child before committing murder in front of her. Then he pulled out his gun and began firing. Not 1 shot, not 2. 10 bullets, fired one after another into Latrice Morris Dorsey's body as she stood there defenseless in her own bedroom. shots to her chest, her back, her hands as she tried to protect herself, and finally to the back of her head as she fell to the floor. The sound of gunshots cut through Justin's video game like thunder cutting through silence. Even with headphones on, he could hear something was terribly wrong. He pulled off his headset and heard his little sister screaming, words that no 14-year-old should ever have to process. "Mom just got shot. Mom just got shot." Justin ran toward his mother's room, but Jada met him in the hallway, her small face streaked with tears and terror. She grabbed onto her big brother with the desperate strength of a child who had just watched her entire world collapse. "Mom just got shot," she kept repeating, as if saying it over and over might somehow make it not true. When Justin reached his mother's bedroom, he found Latrice on the floor, bleeding from multiple wounds, but somehow still clinging to life. Earl Maxwell was already gone, having fled the scene immediately after completing his mission of revenge. Justin dropped to his knees beside his mother and tried to apply pressure to her wounds, screaming for help while attempting CPR he'd learned in a high school health class. The next few minutes felt like hours as Justin fought desperately to save his mother's life. He pressed his hands against her wounds, trying to stop the bleeding, while shouting for neighbors to call 911. 4-year-old Jada stood in the doorway, watching her teenage brother perform CPR on their dying mother, too young to understand death, but old enough to know that something irreversible was happening. Neighbors who heard Justin's screams came running to help. Ron Wilson, who lived next door, took over the CPR while Justin called for an ambulance. Wilson would later tell reporters that he could see multiple bullet wounds across Latrice's body and knew immediately that the situation was beyond what any neighbor could fix with first aid. But even as Wilson worked to keep Latrice breathing and Justin held her hand, they could all see that she was losing her fight for life. The woman who had spent her career helping other people heal was now beyond any medical intervention they could provide. Her breathing became shallow, then irregular, then stopped altogether. Latrice Morris Dorsey took her final breath in her son's arms, while her 4-year-old daughter watched from the bedroom doorway. The last thing she heard was Justin's voice telling her that help was coming and that everything was going to be okay. The last thing she felt was her teenage son's hands trying to keep her heart beating. Paramedics arrived within minutes of the 911 call, but there was nothing left for them to do except confirm what everyone already knew. Latrice was pronounced dead at the scene, another victim of domestic violence who had done everything right but still couldn't escape the man who refused to let her go. While medical personnel worked around Latrice's body, police officers began interviewing Justin about what he had witnessed. The 14-year-old, still covered in his mother's blood, described seeing a black man running from the house and driving away in a dark-colored vehicle immediately after the shooting. His description matched Earl Maxwell perfectly. Within hours, Detroit police had issued an all-points bulletin for Earl Maxwell as a person of interest in Latrice's murder. They released his physical description to local media, including the detail that made him easily identifiable: Latrice's name tattooed on his left arm, a permanent reminder of his obsession with the woman he had just killed. The manhunt for Earl Maxwell became front-page news in Detroit. His photograph appeared on television screens and social media feeds throughout the city, along with warnings that he should be considered armed and extremely dangerous. Police urged anyone who spotted him to call 911 immediately rather than approach him directly. For 2 days, Earl Maxwell remained at large while Latrice's family planned her funeral and tried to figure out how to explain to a 4-year-old why her mother wasn't coming home. The community lived in fear that a man who had already killed once might strike again before police could apprehend him. Then, on June 20th, 2017, Earl Maxwell made a decision that surprised everyone following the case. Instead of continuing to run or forcing a violent confrontation with police, he walked into the Detroit Police Department and turned himself in. He surrendered without incident, finally ready to face the consequences of what he had done on Father's Day. Maxwell was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder and felony firearms violations. The first-degree murder charge was significant because it indicated that prosecutors believed Earl had planned Latrice's killing in advance, making this a death penalty case in states that still allowed capital punishment. As Earl Maxwell sat in a jail cell awaiting trial, Latrice's family began the impossible process of rebuilding their lives around a hole that could never be filled. For months after Latrice's murder, Earl Maxwell finally faced a judge who would determine whether prosecutors had enough evidence to send him to trial for first-degree murder. What the courtroom heard during those preliminary hearings shocked even experienced legal professionals who thought they had seen every possible variation of domestic violence cases. The prosecution's first bombshell came when they presented the official autopsy report to the court. The medical examiner had documented every single wound on Latrice's body, creating a detailed map of Earl Maxwell's rage that painted a picture far more brutal than anyone had imagined. 10 bullet wounds. 10 separate times that Earl had pulled the trigger while Latrice tried to defend herself. But the location of those wounds told an even more disturbing story. Shots to her chest as she faced her attacker. Shots to her hands as she tried to shield herself from the bullets. Shots to her back as she attempted to turn away from the violence. And finally, a shot to the back of her head as she lay dying on her bedroom floor. The prosecution argued that this wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity. This was execution-style murder carried out by a man who had spent weeks planning exactly how he would punish Latrice for the crime of moving on with her life. Each bullet represented a deliberate choice to continue killing even after his victim was clearly defenseless. Paul Dorsey took the witness stand to testify about the phone calls he had received from Earl Maxwell in the weeks leading up to the murder. His testimony was devastating, not just because of what Earl had said, but because of how he had said it. The progression from drunk rambling to cold calculation showed a man who was methodically preparing himself to commit murder. When the defense attorney tried to challenge Paul's testimony, suggesting that he had misunderstood or exaggerated Earl's threats, Paul's response silenced the entire courtroom. "That's because my wife was dead and I'm going through my mind crazy," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that had been building for months. "You guys asked me a question about the worst day of my life, and you want me to be perfectly clear about every detail." The prosecution then revealed Earl Maxwell's own confession, which contained details that destroyed any possibility of claiming the shooting was accidental. According to his statement to police, Earl admitted to shooting Latrice 10 times, but claimed each shot was somehow unintentional. He specifically stated that he accidentally shot her in the back of the head, in her hands, and throughout her body. The prosecutor's voice dripped with sarcasm as he read Earl's confession aloud. He accidentally shot her 10 times. He accidentally shot her in the back of the head. He accidentally shot her in her hands throughout her body, all with that 4-year-old girl in the room. Even Earl's defense attorney seemed uncomfortable with the absurdity of claiming that 10 gunshots could be accidental. The defense team's strategy became clear as the hearing progressed. They weren't trying to prove Earl's innocence. They were trying to get the charges reduced from first-degree murder to something that carried a lighter sentence. They argued that Earl's actions were the result of a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But the prosecution had documented a clear timeline that demolished the crime of passion defense. The threats to Paul Dorsey had occurred over a period of weeks, not moments. Earl had disposed of the murder weapon after the shooting, showing consciousness of guilt. He had fled the scene immediately, rather than staying to help his victim or call for medical assistance. Most damaging of all was the testimony about Earl's behavior in the courtroom itself. Before his lawyer could stop him, Earl had attempted to justify his actions by explaining his twisted version of the relationship. "We were supposed to be dating. We were still dating until this plumber guy came along," he told the judge, as if murdering someone was a reasonable response to romantic competition. The judge listened to Earl's rambling justification with obvious disgust before ordering him to stop talking. But the damage was done. Earl Maxwell had revealed his true motivation in his own words, proving that he believed he owned Latrice Morris Dorsey and had the right to kill her for choosing someone else. After hearing all the evidence, the judge ruled that there was more than enough proof to bind Earl Maxwell over for trial on first-degree murder charges. For years after that Father's Day massacre, Earl Maxwell finally faced a moment of reckoning that Latrice's family had been waiting for. The courtroom was packed with relatives, friends, and supporters who had watched 2 children grow up without their mother while her killer sat in a jail cell. But what happened during that sentencing hearing would leave everyone questioning whether justice had truly been served. Justin Dorsey was no longer the terrified 14-year-old who had held his dying mother in his arms. Now 18 years old, he had spent 4 years processing trauma that most adults couldn't handle, let alone a teenager trying to finish high school. When he stood up to address his mother's killer, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. "My mom was the nicest person, the most caring person," Justin said, looking directly at Earl Maxwell. "And for you to take her out of my life like that hurts my heart so much." His words were simple, but they carried the pain of a son who would never get to share his achievements with the woman who had believed in him most. Latrice's college-age daughter, who had been away at school when her mother was murdered, had her own message for Earl. Her statement was filled with rage that had been building for 4 years, anger at the man who had stolen her mother's chance to see her children graduate, get married, and have families of their own. She told Earl exactly what she thought of his selfish decision to destroy multiple lives because he couldn't handle rejection. The family's pain was made even worse by Earl's behavior during the hearing. Instead of simply accepting responsibility for his actions, he decided to use his time before the judge to offer what he clearly believed was a heartfelt apology. But his words revealed that he still didn't understand the magnitude of what he had done. "I was wrong. I was wrong and I'm sorry, and ain't no way I can repay this," Earl said, as if apologizing for a minor mistake rather than the premeditated murder of a mother. "It's between me and the Lord now. I just want to let y'all know that I have repented with every bone in my body." Earl went on to claim that he could never take back what he had done down here on this earth, as if his earthly actions were somehow separate from his spiritual accountability. Most disturbing of all, he told the courtroom that the Lord gave me a dream that she's with the Lord, and that's the only thing that kept me from killing myself. The audacity of Earl Maxwell using God in dreams about his victim to make himself appear sympathetic was not lost on anyone in that courtroom. Here was a man who had planned and executed a murder, traumatized 2 children for life, and destroyed an entire family, now claiming that divine intervention had saved him from suicide. Latrice's family members shook their heads in disgust as Earl continued his self-serving speech. After 4 years of grief, therapy, and struggling to rebuild their lives, they had to listen to their loved one's killer portray himself as another victim of the tragedy he had created. Judge Kiana Lillard had heard enough. After listening to Earl's rambling justification and hollow apology, she handed down a sentence that would determine how much of his life he would spend behind bars for stealing Latrice's life and devastating her children. 25 to 50 years in prison. Earl Maxwell would be eligible for parole after serving 25 years, meaning he could potentially walk free, while Justin would still be in his early 40s and Jada would be in her late 20s. The sentence meant that Earl might eventually have more years of freedom after prison than Latrice had years of life before he killed her. For a family that had endured 4 years of legal proceedings and a lifetime of grief, the sentence felt like another injustice piled on top of their original loss. Earl Maxwell had received a punishment that acknowledged his crime, but didn't seem to match the magnitude of what he had taken from the world. But in the midst of all that disappointment and pain, there was one source of hope that even Earl Maxwell's selfishness couldn't destroy. Justin Dorsey refused to let his mother's killer define the rest of his story. While Earl Maxwell sat in prison feeling sorry for himself, the 14-year-old boy who had watched his mother die was transforming his grief into something powerful. By his high school graduation, Justin had achieved what seemed impossible in the aftermath of such devastating trauma. He graduated with a perfect 4.0 grade point average. Not just good grades, not just passing marks, but academic excellence that would have made Latrice burst with pride. He spent 6 days a week in the gym, channeling his anger and pain into physical strength that earned him a full football scholarship to Ferris State University. But here's the detail that proves Latrice's influence on her son never died. Justin chose to major in physical therapy, the same profession his mother had loved because it allowed her to help people heal and get their lives back. Even in death, Latrice was still guiding her son toward a career built on compassion and service to others. The real tragedy of this case isn't just that Latrice Morris Dorsey died. It's that her death was completely preventable if our system had taken domestic violence threats seriously. Over 20 documented death threats were reported to Detroit police, and they treated each one like an annoying paperwork problem rather than a woman's life hanging in the balance. The warning signs were textbook perfect. Recent breakup, obsessive behavior, threats made through third parties, and escalating violence. Every domestic violence expert in the country could have predicted that Earl Maxwell was going to kill someone. But the people with badges and the power to intervene decided that verbal threats weren't worth their time. Here's what should have happened the moment Paul Dorsey walked into that police station with documented evidence of death threats. Immediate arrest warrant for Earl Maxwell. Emergency protective order for Latrice and her children. Mandatory psychological evaluation and anger management. Confiscation of any firearms Earl might have owned. Instead, Latrice got a pamphlet about restraining orders and advice to change her phone number. As if a piece of paper would stop a bullet, or a new phone number would make a stalker forget where his victim lived. Every subscriber to this channel helps us expose these system failures that cost innocent lives. If you're not subscribing, you're basically telling us that stories like Latrice don't matter enough to deserve your support. Prove us wrong in the comments, or better yet, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure the next Latrice Morris Dorsey gets the protection she deserves before it's too late.